You're just not cut out for this job, Ethan. Victoria Lane, my manager, spat across the conference table. For years, she paraded my work as her own, collecting promotions while I stayed invisible. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. Instead, I smiled, a smile she mistook for defeat. I'll leave on Friday, I said calmly, but Monday will be interesting. She rolled her eyes, certain she had crushed me once and for all. What she didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for months. By Monday, the walls she built on lies would begin to crumble. The night before everything unraveled, I was still at the office, my eyes burning under the pale glow of a computer screen. It was nearly 2 a.m, and the building was empty except for the dull hum of the server room down the hall. My desk was cluttered with empty coffee cups, sticky notes with reminders scrawled in a rush, and files I hadn't touched in weeks. For the 10th time that month, I had promised my daughter I would make it home for dinner, and for the 10th time, I broke it. By the time I dragged myself through the front door, she was already asleep. I stood at her bedroom door, staring through the small crack where the nightlight painted her face in soft shadows. I whispered, "I'll do better," knowing it was a lie I had told too many times. My wife, Claire, barely stirred when I crawled into bed. Her sigh told me everything: exhaustion, disappointment, and a loneliness she had carried alone while I was buried in code and corporate demands. I told myself all of this was worth it, that one day the company would recognize me. One day, Victoria Lane, my manager, would have no choice but to give me the credit I deserved. But the truth was harsher. For years, every project I built, every system I improved, every late night I endured had been paraded under her name. Promotions went to her. Praise went to her. And me? I was the invisible engine that made her career possible. That night, while debugging a critical piece of software, I stumbled upon something strange. Buried deep in the code was a vulnerability so severe it could bring down the entire network infrastructure of the company. At first, I panicked, thinking of the millions it could cost if exposed. Then another thought came. What if I held on to this? What if this became my ace in the hole, my secret card when they pushed too far? I didn't delete it, didn't report it. I documented it quietly and tucked it away where only I could find it. The knowledge weighed heavy in my chest, but so did years of injustice. If I revealed it now, the company might collapse. If I stayed silent, I alone carried the secret. Either way, the choice clawed at me. The next morning, bleary-eyed, I walked into the conference room. Victoria stood at the head of the table, radiant in her perfectly tailored suit. She spoke with authority, waving her hands over a slide deck projected on the screen. The project she was presenting, the software I had built from scratch, was being hailed as her innovation. Her voice rang with confidence as she described her design, her improvements, her late nights. Not once did she glance at me. Not once did she say my name. The applause at the end felt like a punch to my stomach. Colleagues congratulated her, shook her hand, even clapped her on the back. I stood in the corner, invisible. When I caught her eye, she gave me a subtle smirk, as if to say, "You'll never escape this shadow." That afternoon, during a short break, I stepped outside and called my mother. She was 74 now, frail but sharp as ever. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "the presentation went well." "Did they finally recognize you?" she asked eagerly. There was a pause. "No." Victoria took the credit again. On the other end, silence lingered before she sighed. Ethan, you're almost 50. All your friends from college are directors and vice presidents now. Why do you still let people walk over you? Why haven't you demanded what you deserve? Her disappointment cut deeper than I expected. I wanted to defend myself, to tell her I was playing the long game, but the words felt hollow. That evening, as I returned to my office, I noticed my closest colleague, Daniel, closing his laptop hurriedly as I walked by. He had been my friend for years, the only one I trusted in this building. We had shared late-night coffees, traded stories about our families, even covered for each other when deadlines loomed. But when I saw the folder he had been working on, my chest tightened. It contained my source files, the ones only I had access to. His face paled when he realized I had seen them. "Ethan," he stammered, "this isn't what you think." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Later, during another one of Victoria's flawless presentations, I heard her describe details so specific only Daniel and I had ever discussed them. The betrayal was clear. My closest ally had handed my work directly to her. I sat in that room, hands clenched beneath the table, my heart pounding in my ears. For years, I believed betrayal came from enemies, from rivals with knives out. But the sharpest cut came from the friend who stood at your side, smiling, while slipping the blade between your ribs. As Victoria basked in the applause once again, I forced myself to stay silent, to keep the storm inside me contained. Because now, with the vulnerability I had discovered and the truth of Daniel's treachery, the pieces of a different game were forming. And for the first time, I thought, perhaps this wasn't the end of me. Perhaps this was just the beginning. After Daniel's betrayal, something inside me shifted. I stopped expecting fairness and started looking for patterns. The whispers in the hall, the sudden exclusion from meetings, the carefully worded emails that painted me as unreliable. It was no accident. Within a week, I pieced together fragments of conversations and forwarded emails until the picture became undeniable. My removal had been planned long before Victoria ever called me incompetent. The realization struck hardest one morning when I stumbled across an internal memo not meant for my eyes. Buried in the metadata was my name on a list labeled transition candidates. I wasn't just expendable. I was marked for elimination. At first, I thought Victoria was orchestrating it all, but the more I dug, the clearer it became. She wasn't clever enough to design a plot this clean. She was merely the face of it. The real puppet master was higher up, the director of operations, Leonard Briggs, a man known for smiling too warmly and asking questions that sounded harmless until you realized they were traps. That night, I drove home in silence. Claire noticed immediately. She set down her wine glass and studied me across the dinner table. "You're quieter than usual," she said softly. "Something happened at work, didn't it?" I forced a smile, shaking my head. "Just a long day." Her eyes narrowed, but she let it drop. Still, the silence between us was heavier than any words. She went to tuck our daughter into bed while I sat on the couch, staring at nothing, fighting the urge to tell her everything. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I turned my focus to survival. I began quietly saving everything. Email threads where Victoria claimed credit, financial records that hinted at manipulation, private chats where Briggs discussed strategic removals. I encrypted it all, storing copies on drives no one else could reach. Every click of my mouse felt like treason, but each file tucked away felt like armor. The question gnawed at me. If this truth came out, could I survive it? Or would the company crush me before anyone listened? I asked myself in silence what I now ask you. Have you ever felt like a pawn on a chessboard, moved without your consent, sacrificed for someone else's endgame? As the weeks passed, I transformed my role. By day, I played the loyal employee, nodding through meetings where my voice didn't matter. By night, I became a collector of secrets. I discovered backdoors in the system and created a few of my own, hidden layers of code that only I could access. They were invisible doors into the heart of the company, and I held the keys. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was strategy. A long game where patience was my weapon. I mapped out scenarios. What if they accused me of fraud? What if they fired me without cause? What if they tried to blacklist me in the industry? For every possibility, I built a countermeasure. Then one evening, while sifting through encrypted traffic logs, I found something unexpected. A trail of activity that wasn't mine. Someone else was inside the system, leaving subtle markers as if testing the locks. At first, I thought it was an external hacker, but the precision suggested otherwise. This was someone on the inside. Someone who, like me, didn't trust the company. The idea that I wasn't alone both comforted and terrified me. If this person shared my goals, we could be allies. But if they were playing their own game, they could ruin everything. The shadows had grown thicker, and I didn't know which way the knives pointed. Meanwhile, reality pressed harder. My mother collapsed one morning and was rushed to the hospital. The doctors talked in circles, but the truth was plain. Her heart was failing. The cost of her care spiraled into numbers I couldn't bear to look at. Claire suggested we take out a loan or ask the company for assistance, but I refused. The same people trying to bury me wouldn't get the satisfaction of watching me beg. Pride, stubbornness, maybe both. But I knew if I surrendered that part of myself, I would lose the last piece of integrity I still had. Each night, I sat by her hospital bed, her frail hand resting in mine. She never asked about work anymore. She didn't need to. The exhaustion in my eyes told her everything. She would only whisper, "Don't let them break you, Ethan." Back at the office, I tightened my preparations. The files I'd collected grew heavier. The code I planted more intricate. Every step forward was another thread, woven into a net I could pull tight when the moment came. And yet, with each safeguard, the question burned deeper. If I unleashed this, I wouldn't just destroy Victoria or Briggs. I would drag down innocent people who had no part in this game. I sat alone in the dim light of my office, staring at the blinking cursor on my screen, and thought, if I trigger my secret card, I can save myself. But the price might be everyone else. It happened on a gray Monday morning, the kind where the sky itself seemed to know something was about to break. My badge refused to open the side entrance, forcing me toward the main lobby where security waited. Their faces were stiff, their eyes avoiding mine. "Mr. Walker," one of them said, "you've been requested in conference room A." The words sounded polite, but the tone carried the weight of judgment. Inside the room, the blinds were drawn, the air heavy. Around the table sat Victoria Lane, Leonard Briggs, and 2 members of HR. A folder lay on the table, thick with papers. "Ethan," Victoria began smoothly, "serious allegations have been raised against you. Financial improprieties, misuse of company resources, even data manipulation." She slid the folder toward me as though it were a gift. We have evidence. I opened it. At first, the shock hit like a punch to the gut. The documents, detailed wire transfers, altered system logs, and emails that seemed to show me routing money to personal accounts. My hands tightened on the edges of the paper. The transactions were fabricated, but they looked real. Too real. Then I saw the digital signature embedded in the logs. Recognition surged like ice through my veins. It belonged to someone I knew, someone I had once protected. Months earlier, I had covered for a junior analyst named Corey Bennett when he made a mistake that nearly cost us a contract. I saved his job. And now, the so-called evidence framing me had Corey's fingerprints all over it. Leonard Briggs leaned back, his smile too polished. "This is serious, Mr. Walker. Very serious. We could take this to law enforcement." I looked across the table at Victoria. Her eyes were cold, but behind them flickered something like unease. She wanted me gone, but she didn't expect me to fight. "You're replaceable," she said finally, her voice like glass breaking. For a moment, silence filled the room. My career, my reputation, years of sacrifice, all collapsing in a few sheets of paper. And yet, instead of rage, I felt something else, a strange calm. Slowly, I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. A small smile formed on my lips. They saw a man cornered. I knew better. This wasn't the end. This was the first move in a game they didn't even realize I had been playing. I stood, adjusted my jacket, and without another word, walked out of the room. Behind me, I felt their relief, their smug certainty that they had buried me. But in my chest, I carried a secret they could never erase. By the time I reached the parking lot, my decision was clear. The back door I had built months ago, the one they didn't know existed, was waiting. That evening, in the quiet of my home office, I sat at my computer, fingers trembling not from fear, but anticipation. One keystroke after another, I slipped through the layers of the company's defenses, passing silently into the very systems I had built. For a moment, I hesitated. Once I pulled the trigger, there would be no return. This wasn't just about taking down Victoria anymore. It was about exposing the entire web of deceit that stretched through the company. The financial manipulation, the falsified records, the skeletons buried in hidden servers. It would all come crashing out into the open. I pressed forward. Encrypted files streamed into secure drives. Copies of conversations between executives, bank statements, contracts that hinted at corruption. All of it flowed into my archive. When I had enough, I prepared a package. By dawn, it was on its way to journalists I trusted and regulators who couldn't be bought. As the data transferred, my phone buzzed. Victoria's name lit the screen. For a long moment, I let it ring. Finally, I answered. Her voice, usually sharp and commanding, was thin and strained. "Ethan, stop this. Please. You don't know what you're doing. We can work something out." I didn't respond right away. The sound of her desperation was almost satisfying. She, who had once looked at me as nothing, now sounded like a drowning woman begging for air. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "It's already done." There was silence on the other end, then the faintest sound of her breath catching. I ended the call. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion and adrenaline colliding inside me. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, the chance to strike back, to prove I wasn't just replaceable. And yet, a small part of me whispered a warning. Had I gone too far? Could I control what I had unleashed? As the sun rose outside my window, I stared at the files leaving my system and thought, I had prepared for this day. But could I possibly have calculated all the consequences? The fallout began faster than I ever imagined. By Tuesday morning, headlines blared across every major outlet. Tech giant under fire for financial misconduct. The articles carried snippets of the files I had released, fraudulent contracts, manipulated numbers, and emails that painted an ugly picture of greed and deception. By noon, the company's stock plummeted 20%, and customers began canceling contracts in waves. Investors demanded answers, but the board remained silent, scrambling to contain the firestorm. Inside the company, whispers turned into shouts. Managers accused subordinates. Subordinates blamed managers, and even the most loyal employees began to question who had been lying to them all along. Rumors of arrests spread like wildfire, and entire teams froze, afraid to take the wrong step. The empire that once looked indestructible now showed cracks everywhere. Then came the twist I hadn't expected. While I sat at my kitchen table, watching the chaos unfold on television, a new set of documents surfaced, this time from a completely anonymous source. They were just as damning as mine, filled with details I had never uncovered. Someone else out there had decided to strike at the same moment, amplifying the destruction. The timing was perfect. Too perfect. It left me uneasy. Was this anonymous ally working with me or against me? Or were they simply another pawn in the game, throwing stones into the fire? That night, as I tucked my daughter into bed, she looked at me with wide, searching eyes. "Daddy," she asked, "did you do something bad? On the TV, they said people at your company cheated. Did you cheat too?" The question pierced deeper than any accusation in a boardroom. For a moment, I couldn't answer. I brushed her hair back gently and whispered, "No, sweetheart. I told the truth. Sometimes, telling the truth makes people angry, but I did it because it was the right thing." She nodded, though I wasn't sure she understood. What mattered was that I wasn't lying to her. Not this time. Lying awake later, I thought of all the innocent people who would suffer from this collapse. Employees who had no part in the schemes. Families who depended on those paychecks. Justice had a price, and I wondered if I had been too eager to make others pay it. The micro cliffhanger echoed in my thoughts. When justice explodes, who gets crushed first? By the end of the week, the government had stepped in. Investigators raided offices, seizing servers and boxes of files. The scale of corruption they uncovered went far beyond what I had imagined. Shell companies, offshore accounts, even bribes to regulators. The scandal was no longer a story about one corrupt manager. It was a rot that reached the highest levels of the corporation. The smartest employees, the ones with options, began leaving in droves. Department heads resigned overnight, and those who stayed behind watched their projects collapse for lack of leadership. The once glittering empire imploded, not with a bang, but with a steady crumbling that no one could stop. Through it all, Victoria's name dominated the news. She was painted as the mastermind, the schemer who had orchestrated the fraud. But buried in the investigators' reports was a detail that made me pause. She hadn't been the architect. She had been following orders. Leonard Briggs had used her as his shield, setting her up to take the fall when the walls closed in. She was ambitious, yes, and guilty of her own betrayals, but she had never held the real power. That revelation unsettled me more than it should have. For years, I had focused all my rage on her. She had been the face of my humiliation, the one who stole my work and mocked my worth. Yet now, I realized she was a pawn in a larger game, just like me. One Saturday afternoon, I ran into Daniel, the colleague who had betrayed me, at the supermarket. He froze when he saw me by the produce aisle, his hand tightening on the basket. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his face flushed with shame. I stood there, rooted, a bitter taste in my mouth. Seeing him retreat like that didn't feel like victory. It felt hollow. That night, sitting alone in my living room, I wondered, if the enemy you've hated all along turns out to be just another victim, do you keep striking? Or do you let the blade fall from your hand? The question lingered like smoke, unanswered. It was a rainy Thursday evening when the knock came at my door. Claire peeked through the window, her face paling as she whispered, "It's her." Standing on the porch, drenched under the downpour, was Victoria Lane. Her perfect composure was gone. Her hair clung to her face, her eyes red-rimmed. For a long moment, I considered not opening the door, but curiosity, and maybe something darker, made me turn the handle. The moment she stepped inside, Claire grabbed our daughter and hurried her into the back room. I could hear my little girl ask in a trembling voice, "Why is Daddy angry?" Claire hushed her gently, but their fear pressed against me harder than any words Victoria might say. Victoria stood dripping in the living room, shaking. "Ethan," she began, her voice cracking, "please, listen to me. I need you to understand. I never wanted it to go this far. I folded my arms. You stole my work. You humiliated me. You said I was replaceable. Why should I listen to you now?" Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time, I saw not the ruthless manager, but a woman cornered. Tears blurred her mascara as she whispered, "Because I was trapped. Leonard wasn't the top. He answered to something bigger. There's a group, an alliance of executives across industries. They protect each other, trade favors, bury scandals. I thought I was joining a path to power, but it was a cage. They use us as pawns, Ethan. You think you won, but you've only cut off one head of a monster that grows more." Her words chilled me. I had expected excuses, maybe desperation, but a secret cabal pulling strings across companies? It sounded like madness, yet after everything I had seen, could I dismiss it? She sank onto the couch, clutching her hands together. "I fought to survive. I betrayed you because if I hadn't, they would have destroyed me too. Don't you see? We're all just pieces on their board." The sight of her crying, shaking, undone, twisted my insides. For years, I had painted her as the villain of my story. Now she looked less like an enemy and more like another casualty. And yet, could tears wash away the damage she had done? My wife's fearful eyes, my daughter's broken trust, my mother's disappointment. They were all scars she helped carve. I stared at her, my silence heavier than any accusation. In my mind, one question rang clear: forgiving the person who destroyed me. Was that strength or madness? Days later, the truth deepened. Through anonymous channels, I began receiving messages. Encrypted, signed with digital fingerprints I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a trap, but the information they shared was real. Proof of more corruption, not just in my company, but in others connected through contracts and shadow deals. It wasn't just me. It wasn't just one corporation. The twist struck hardest when I realized some of these leaks came from people I had once assumed were enemies. a vice president who always seemed complicit. He had been feeding information to watchdog groups for years. A senior auditor I thought was blind to fraud. She had quietly gathered evidence, waiting for the right moment. The resistance wasn't mine alone. It was a web, hidden in the cracks of the corporate machine. And I wasn't the only victim who decided to fight back. Stories began surfacing of employees and other companies stepping forward, emboldened by the chaos I'd unleashed. Whistleblowers, once silenced, now stood together. What I thought was my personal war had become something larger, a movement of people who refused to be crushed anymore. When I visited my mother in the hospital, she took my hand, frail but steady. Her eyes gleamed with pride as she whispered, "Ethan, you've done what your father never dared. He spent his life swallowing his pride, afraid to fight the system. But you broke the silence." Her words cut me deeper than any accolade. For years, I thought I was chasing recognition, revenge, survival. But maybe what I had really been doing was refusing to inherit silence, refusing to pass it on to my daughter. And yet the weight of choice pressed harder. The files I held now were more devastating than anything before. If I released everything, the empire of lies could burn to the ground. But so could innocent lives tied to it. If I held back, maybe justice would come slower, but fewer people would be destroyed in the crossfire. I stared at the encrypted drives late into the night, my reflection in the dark screen. One thought lingered, gnawing, relentless. Should I reveal the entire truth or keep part of it buried to protect the innocent? The storm eventually passed, though not without leaving wreckage in its wake. Weeks later, I walked into a different building, smaller, humbler, but alive with an energy I hadn't felt in years. This was my new workplace. They didn't look at me as the man who had been accused, framed, and discarded. They saw me as someone who had survived, who had chosen to fight rather than bend. The first time my new colleagues introduced me to a client, they didn't hesitate to use my name. That simple recognition felt like a luxury. One morning, I woke before sunrise, not because of dread or deadlines, but because I wanted to. I slipped quietly into my daughter's room and whispered, "Let's go." She blinked sleepily, then grinned when she realized. For the first time in her young life, I walked her to school, hand in hand, just as the bell rang. Watching her run toward the playground, turning back to wave at me, I felt a weight I hadn't noticed lifting. I wasn't just her father again, I was present. That small moment was worth more than any promotion I had ever chased. The twist came a few weeks into the job. During a team lunch, I learned the truth about the company I had joined. It wasn't just a startup. It had been founded by people who, like me, were survivors of Victoria's reign. Engineers, analysts, even a former project manager. All of them had once been silenced or betrayed by the same system I fought against. They had built something new, not just for profit, but as proof that a workplace could thrive on trust and fairness. It was a revelation that left me speechless. In time, my name began circulating beyond office walls. Journalists called me not a whistleblower, but a symbol. Panels invited me to speak about corporate ethics, about the cost of silence. I didn't crave the attention, but I understood the responsibility. I had become, unwillingly, a voice against corruption. Yet one night, as I sat in my office after everyone had gone home, an email appeared in my inbox. The sender was anonymous, the subject line stark. "The story isn't over." No body text, just an encrypted attachment. My pulse quickened. Was it a threat? A warning? Or the beginning of another chapter in a battle I thought I had finished? The old company did not survive untouched. Its stock collapsed, investors fled, and regulators tore it apart piece by piece. But rather than die, it was rebuilt, reformed under new leadership, stripped of the rot that had poisoned it. From the outside, it looked like a victory, proof that justice could reshape what greed had broken. On my daughter's birthday, I stood beside her as she blew out her candles. For the first time, I was there from the start of the party to the end. No phone calls, no excuses, no late-night absences. She threw her arms around me, frosting smeared on her cheek, and whispered, "This is the best birthday ever." Claire caught my eye across the room, and the smile we shared was one of healing, not survival. Another twist reached me through a news article weeks later. Daniel, the colleague who had once betrayed me, was no longer climbing corporate ladders. He had left it all behind. The story described him volunteering at a local shelter, helping displaced workers rebuild their lives. Whether it was guilt or redemption, I didn't know. But something in me softened. The wheel had turned, and he was no longer the man who stabbed me in the back, but another casualty who chose to change. The more I reflected, the clearer my path became. It wasn't enough to move on. Others were still trapped in the same cycle I had escaped. I began building something larger than myself, a foundation dedicated to protecting workers who faced injustice, giving them tools, legal support, and courage to stand where I once could not. What began as my revenge was slowly transforming into my legacy. One night, long after the world had gone quiet, I sat by my daughter's bedside. She was asleep, her small chest rising and falling with steady breaths. I brushed her hair gently from her face and whispered, "I kept my promise." In the silence, I realized the truth I had been chasing all along. Revenge may have started my journey, but justice was what sustained it. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in watching others fall. It's in building something from the ashes that proves they never won. And so, my story closed not with fire and ruin, but with a lesson etched deep into me. Sometimes, the greatest revenge is rebuilding justice from the rubble of betrayal.